Hi, and welcome to the Why People Buy podcast, a podcast about the motivations and buyer psychology of growth in the food and beverage industry. I'm your host, Seth Waite, partner at Schaefer. And with me today is longtime friend and absolute expert in the Why People Buy industry, and that is John Schnettgoecke. So welcome, John.
Here, Seth. Glad that we're finally doing this.
Yeah, it's been a long time in the making. I'm going to start off with just some kind of hot takes, questions about food and beverage, and then we'll dig into get to know you questions and things like that. So, John, right now, what is your go-to snack? What are you buying, picking up at the shelves, those kind of things?
Go-to snack. I'm always tempted to say something new here or like a hot new brand that I've tried, but I'm fairly routine oriented. So you won't be surprised by this one. We're fully stocked with Chomps all the time. So anytime I'm grabbing or reaching for a snack, I find myself, reaching for Chomps. Like on the sweeter side, I think I shared this with you a couple of days ago, but the Siete, cookies of a variety of different flavors, like grain-free, gluten-free cookies. That's usually like an after-dinner thing. But between, I guess, meat sticks and cookies, that's primarily what I'm reaching for outside of standard mealtime right now.
Nice. That's awesome. And go-to beverage.
Go-to beverage, again, routine-oriented. This is like always next to me. This is always typically got an element in it, just an electrolyte drink mix. So between element and occasionally we're stocked with like the Fairlife chocolate milk, like protein drinks as well. I get into trouble with those because I tend to drink them too fast. So we go through cycles of having them stocked, and then, a couple of months where they're effectively off limits to me. But between the Fairlife and element, that's typically what I'm always sipping on.
Yeah, that's awesome. We have to keep our Fairlife chocolate milks in the garage so that they're not cold, which limits the process of how many of those I'm drinking on a regular basis along with the kids.
Yeah, I hadn't considered that. Ours are always cold, and I reach for them after a workout and they're so crushable.
Yes.
That's when I typically get into trouble, and my significant other has to basically like ration them, and I'm always afraid that she's like counting them, when she knows
Yeah,
how many are in there before she leaves the house and how many should be in there when she comes back.
totally. Yeah. We go through the cases, like the big boxes at a speed that I feel is probably ashamed to admit out loud, but they're awesome. Well, cool. Let's get into who's John Schnettgoecke. And I want to ask you this question that I ask everybody, and that is, if a, friend in the industry was introducing you, what would they say?
That's a good question.
What would I tell people about you?
Yeah, what I'm trying to think of is like, what would you tell people, or like, what would my parents tell people? I know they're not in the industry, but that's the one
Yeah.
that, you know.
Tell us both.
So my parents, I've been in product, in marketing roles, in consulting roles pretty much my whole career on the agency side, in-house, startup. So I've had a bit of a meandering career path. So my parents still to this day would probably say that I'm in advertising, right, wrong, indifferent. Like that's what I got my degree in way back when, and then started in the advertising agency world. And so I think it's easier for my parents to say, he's in advertising, he's in tech, he's in marketing. Like they kind of just rotate through the greatest hits. If you or somebody, in the industry, like colleagues that know me, typically like this is a little bit based in, I guess, what I've heard in the past, people will generally introduce me as a strategist, which as you know is kind of the bane of a strategist's existence. It's really hard to quantify exactly what that means. But in digging, I think what people generally are trying to say, and what I would say about myself, is that kind of regardless of role or industry, I guess my type A brain like processes things in a more linear, like logical fashion. And so that lends itself, I've found, fairly well to trying to apply like logical reasoning to all sorts of different problems and spaces from a product standpoint or a marketing standpoint. So I think generally as I've meandered my way through my career into different spaces and doing different things, I'm typically the guy that asks, well, why are we doing it that way? And what if we did it like this? Or what if we considered taking a slightly different approach to solve this problem? That doesn't mean that that's always the right way or it leads us down the right path. But I think generally people, when they say, John's a strategist or John does this, I think that's typically what they're trying to say when I've pushed some of those people to like unpack that a little bit.
Yeah. No, that is accurate. I would say I give you kind of two core areas, and everyone's obviously complex and more than just these
Yeah.
summaries we're giving. But like for me, one of those is you have the ability to go from big idea to like practical roadmap. So it's like, cool, that's great. Now let's talk about how to get there. And you have the ability to take very little information and turn that into, here's the plan, here's the process, here's all the questions that are unanswered, those kind of thing. And I think the part that's really interesting and special that I've seen over the years, because John and I have known each other for 15 years, worked together.
Just about, if we do the math, the rough math on that, coming up
Yeah.
on 15.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we were both basically like starting our careers,
Mm-hmm.
just stepping into the agency world and having a really good time. But the other thing I would say is you can take that strategy, that plan, that perspective, and then turn that into really clear communication. And I think that's also the other thing. Like, it's not just deck building and stuff like that, but I think it really is just like breaking things down. And this maybe is the same skill. You just have the ability to break things down in their simplest form, whether that's in the planning or the communication process. It's always been something that I've appreciated as part of that
Yeah,
deal.
that's nice of you to say. I think as you will attest, when we were young and naive, like early in our careers, like kind of making things up along the way, I found that, anytime you were asked to put something together or put a plan together, like the question from either clients, bosses, what have you, was always like, and then what? And then what? So I think my brain just got into the habit of asking, like, okay, I've reached a stopping point with this plan or this roadmap or whatever, but and then what? And so I'm always trying at least to think about like what comes next. And that's also, part of my systems focused brain, which is a blessing and a curse at times.
Total blessing. It's a complete compliment to my non-systems brain. I think I'm usually the guy that's like, hey, I got this really big idea. And you're
Uh,
the guy that's like, hey, let's
how are we going to
figure
do
out,
this? Yeah.
yeah, is this possible? What I've appreciated though is a lot of times systems people, they get really caught on why it won't work. And while you're
Hmm.
always very aware of the limitations, I think what makes you very unique in that perspective is you always show up with a like, we can figure out how to do this. We just don't know how to do it yet mentality
Yes.
rather than a, hey, this is not possible. Like, let's slam on the brakes. So
Yes.
awesome. In terms of just background experience, kind of like origin story, how you got here. Obviously, I know it. We've crossed paths a lot over the years, but like, what does your professional experience look like? How'd you get to, buyer psychology lead at Schaefer?
Yeah. I think like in simplest terms, as I've alluded to already, I've kind of had a meandering career path, which you've had a front row seat to. Kind of started in the advertising world, moved into, digital agency, then kind of pushed into product development and tech. But I think the one common thread throughout my careers in all of those roles, working for a variety of different companies across a variety of different industries, like it's always been my job to think, whether it be for the company I'm working for or the client who's hired us to do work for them, always thinking about, well, how do we grow? What does the path to growth look like? And what does the path to sustainable growth look like? And so I've spent a lot of time, like I said, in the product and marketing side of a lot of different companies, helping founders and their teams specifically think about, if we want to grow to X in Y time, what are the pathways to get there? What are the different levers that we can pull to try and make that happen? And so that in and of itself just lends itself, I think, to like a natural curiosity and like scenario planning and trying to understand, if we do this, how does that affect the rest of the business, the rest of the company, the rest of the decisions we might have to make? And so I've always just, I think, found myself trying to think through those types of problems in rather like logical ways, and just having a little bit of like the marketing lean that has become kind of a, I would say, more of just a core part of what I do. And then, getting into food and beverage was never really like the plan. But I think just looking throughout our past history, we've done a lot of work with food and beverage businesses kind of across the spectrum. And as you will attest, like I think we all kind of got to a point in our respective careers where we just said, we really enjoy working with these types of companies, and we have, I think, a unique perspective and a unique set of skills that is, applicable, highly applicable to this industry. And so, now I get to use like that natural curiosity in a way that continues to help food and beverage businesses answer that question, like what does growth look like and how do we get there? Where does growth come from? And in particular nowadays, we look at it kind of from the customer side of things. So, growth related to, new products, new customer segments, new geographies, pushing into areas that, companies like this haven't been before. So on the customer side, it's really interesting and fun work to help people think through, if you've built a business on the back of a particular customer segments or a particular type of customer, and you want to continue pushing beyond that core customer segment, what does that look like? Who are those people? Why will they buy from us? Why won't they buy from us? How likely are they to remain brand loyal? And we take a look at all that stuff, right? It kind of exists in a vacuum, but you have to also back out and think about, the sort of macroeconomic or societal factors that are also helping to shape some of those whys as well. So I guess that's a roundabout way of answering. But I think the TLDR version of that is just kind of natural curiosity, always been put in a position to help companies grow. 15 years into my career, I'm now in a place where we have kind of very intentionally decided like this is what we enjoy doing with these types of companies. And now looking at it through a slightly different lens, which is helping food and beverage businesses understand who their customers are, both current and those that might be likely to buy for them so they can continue to kind of set themselves on that growth path.
That's awesome. Yeah. And as you think about, that idea then of, okay, we're now helping people understand why they buy and using this curiosity, how would you define buyer psychology and like the idea of why people buy?
Yeah. To me, it's hard to, well, I guess I won't approach it from like an academic point of view because that's not how my brain thinks about it. And maybe that's because I don't have a 20 or 30-year history in food and beverage doing this exact thing. It kind of comes from a newer, I guess, fresher approach. And again, my own like naivete is probably maybe an advantage in this case. But I think from my perspective, what makes a lot of sense for anyone that's in food and beverage, like running a business, thinking about who their customers are, why they buy, why they wouldn't buy from them, is to start from the perspective of like what people are currently doing today. We take a look at like behaviors first. So, for example, like, are people currently buying? Yes or no? If not, have they ever bought in the past? If yes, why did they stop? And are they likely to purchase again in the future? Why or why not? And that lends itself to just some really easy kind of mutually exclusive top line segmentation work where you can start to just throw people in different buckets based on, what might be the best type of customer group for your business. And then from there, we also start layering in like some motivational perspective. So not just what people say they're going to do, but why they might be likely to buy or why they might be likely to reactivate, as we say, if they've stopped purchasing in the past. And it's just those kind of like logical curiosities that to me make a ton of sense, especially if you're trying to start from like a more unbiased perspective where you're just trying to get a lens through like who's out there, what are they doing? What are they buying? Why are they buying those things? And then that helps us kind of set the tone, so to speak, for some of the later work that we do when we get into like actual motivations, demographics, and those types of things.
It's cool. And I mean, can you give me an example of, what a brand might, let's talk CPG, for instance, it could be food service or manufacturing, a bunch of other things, but like, can you give me like a CPG example of I'm a founder or I'm the head of brand or marketing? What would this look like?
Yeah, yeah. So we, what the first one that pops in my head is actually on the food service side. So we did some recent work with a founder of kind of a small retail cafe footprint, and she came to us, effectively looking for who her best fit customers are, and kind of the task for us was, she said, I think we know our customer and I think they look like this. I think it's this group of people, but we'd like you guys to take kind of a fresh look at this and come back to us and tell us what you find. And so from our perspective, that's great because we get to cast like a really wide net and paint a picture of the entire market. And in this case, she runs a small cafe, which is primarily selling and sourcing like locally sourced ingredients, products, ready to eat meals, those types of things. And so what we do initially is we'll go out and take the perspective of, well, how many people are currently proactively seeking out and buying these types of products today? Again, are they doing that right now? If not, have they done it before? If yes, why did they stop? And then we're kind of just putting people in these segments based on their natural behaviors. Then as we layer on motivation, it helps tell us why people are buying, at least again, at a very top level. And most of this is done through quantitative survey work. So we're adding more detail on top of what people are telling us. And finally, that leads us to like what we call demographic clustering. So after we're able to put somebody in a segment based on the fact that they're currently, shopping for locally sourced products and ingredients on a weekly basis, they're spending $200 a week, for example, on these types of products. Then the natural question we ask is like, well, who are these people? Are there any patterns from a demographic standpoint in terms of who these people might be? Are there separate clusters that are appearing that might be distinct addressable segments? And so we went through that whole process with her, and in the end, we're able to produce, about 8 to 10 different subsegments of people that she hadn't been focused on up until this point. And, one of those included who she thought was her core customer. And so that
Yeah.
was validating in and of itself. But what we were able to give her essentially was another, you know, 4 of those 8 that could be priority customer segments for her business as they were thinking about expanding into new areas. And so practically speaking, what that gives her and what she and her team does with that information is able to use, motivational uh, the motivational information that we gather from a messaging standpoint, and then the demographics give her a perspective through which to go test, ad targeting, messaging, all those types of things to measure, real world receptiveness to message and to product and that type of thing. So that was a 150-page deck summarized
Yeah.
into hopefully like 5 minutes. But that's the type of stuff that we're doing, the perspective that we're bringing, because as I think most people will attest, no matter what business you're in, if you're in the day to day and running it all the time, it's fairly easy to get pretty myopic, and you don't always stop to do that type of work to better understand who all is out there, why they might be likely to buy your product, and who actually represents a potential growth segment for you.
Yeah. I mean, we talk to a lot of food and beverage brands, and I think what's really interesting always is typically there's like these 2 categories. You've got people who are like, "I know this information's valuable, but," and it's
Hmm.
usually like, "But I don't have time, I don't have budget. I'll get to this in the future." And I will say there is a small category of people who are like, "I know this is valuable, but I already know my customer." That's also part of
Hmm.
that group. Like, I've talked to the grandma and I had a good conversation with my neighbor once, and like I just intuitively know who these people are. And those are not people that are going to be convinced to do research in most cases. Like the question's never like, which research company should I work with? It's usually like, I'm either going to do it or I'm not. And for a lot of those people, it's not. And I think they miss out on obviously a huge amount of information that would help that work. On the flip side, I think the other kind of core group is people who are saying, look, we're about to do something, whether
Hmm.
we're launching a new product, maybe we just did something like we just came out with this new product, or we're moving into a new geography, something to that effect. They have a big strategic element, and it's either not working the way that they expected. So now they're like on the defense trying to figure out what's going on, or they just can't afford to have a miss. And so there's this moment of like, we think we've got everything, tied up the way that it needs to be, but we're just not confident enough as part of the process. And so, yeah, those are usually the kind of people we're talking to in this is like, I'm looking to be sure about the next step and I don't want to make a misstep in the process because that's more expensive and more time consuming and can damage a brand as part of it.
I think the piece that goes along with that that we see quite often too is in that same conversation, we'll talk to founders or brand managers or whomever. And the conversation most of the time is, like we've been in business for X number of years. We've built the business to this revenue mark largely off the back of this particular customer group with this product or this set of products. And now, we want to grow because we want to grow, or we've just taken on new investment and we have to grow. And so in so doing, I think sometimes they feel like, well, if we're going to go and expand and attract a new type of customer, we just take the same product, the same messaging, all packaged the same, and we'll go share that message with this group of people. And then we'll back into whatever our, cost of acquisition is, and it'll turn into a math problem. We'll go down the road. And, you know, it just doesn't typically work like that. And so from a why people buy perspective, like that's where some of the work that we do is really interesting. And I think we found fairly useful, but it's really interesting to somebody like me when you think about, what's on the line from a business perspective, but also think about what changes need to be made in order to reach a new group of people who might have completely different motivations or reasons for even considering buying your products. And how does that then translate to, the brand manager and the marketing team? What changes have to be made from an executional perspective to deliver that message about the product in such a way that you have stoked someone's potential appetite to buy? And those things aren't the same when you're talking to a 35-year-old mother of three versus a
Yeah.
37-year-old, unmarried male like myself. Like there's different, that sounds obvious, but in execution and application, I think we find far more often than not, there tends to be this, like, we're going to use the same approach and to try and reach multiple groups of people, when in reality, it's a very nuanced type of, it's easy to figure out, right? It just
Yeah.
takes doing the work. It's not some black box, but
Yeah.
that work often takes time, and time is limited for most people.
You got to have a lot of conversations to figure that out, whether that's quantitatively through surveys and all those things or interviews. Yeah, it's really interesting. I always come back to that, that conversation around the behaviors and motivation piece, because oftentimes you're trying to figure out, right, how, if I can understand my customer better and I know who they are and I know who they're not, then I can create market positioning that really works. Like, this is where we are on the map of all of our competitors. Like, I think about like protein, for instance. We work with protein companies. There's a ton right now. And if you're thinking like bars, that's a fairly easy entrance. Like protein bars that get extruded and have those experiences, like you can make them pretty cheaply. And for that reason, lots of bars are really similar. And most people are approaching it almost like beverage, like canned drinks. Like it's mostly just comes down to brand. And so when you know who your customer is, you can have a really different conversation around where should we be positioned at in a market that might be super fractured or have really easy entrance as part of the process and is super competitive. And then that positioning adjusts offer, like what's our price? What's the size of our packaging? If it's food service, same thing. Like, where do we put this on the menu? Is this premium versus value based? And then I think obviously to your point too, you made the conversation, like then it drives messaging, all your ads, all your materials, even the packaging that you put together, like all of that is tied back to, we know who our customer, we know who they're not, we know what they care about. And I think too often food brands, whether it's food service or CPGs or manufacturers, they're constantly showing up and acting like everybody's their customer. And there's this feeling, I think, especially in food and beverage, like, Well, I mean, everybody would want to use this. And the reality is if 100 people walk down that grocery aisle, maybe 9 of them
Hmm.
actually would buy this product. And usually that's enough. Like that usually translates into multi-billion dollar markets, but you have to know I'm talking to 9 people and I'm comfortable with 91 of them walking by. They're not my customer. And I think that's really hard for me.
Yeah, and I hope it doesn't sound like what we're describing is like the end all be all way of figuring out who your customer is, like why they buy, and that's the end of it, right? I think our perspective, or at least mine, is again, this is like back to the natural curiosity thing and systems focus is so many people that we talk to will come to us and say, well, like, this is my customer, or I think that my customer will do these things or behave in this way, or they care about these things. And frankly, are pretty open when pushed that a number of those things are, in fact, assumptions, right? Or are have been told to them by somebody else. And so now it's just become kind of like gospel. When in actuality, I think what we're trying to do, or what at least I find far more interesting, is trying to build some sort of systematic approach that gets us to something that's a little bit more scientific. Doesn't mean that it's super complex, but how do you get to something that is at least logical, a process that gets you to a place where you can say, we went in with these assumptions about this particular customer group, and we came out of this quantitative or qualitative or both. We came out of this research with information from these groups of people that either validate or invalidate what we thought. And now you've got data that you can go use to test, right? And that's really all it is. It's not, we've done the research and now this is absolute concrete fact from here until the end of time. It's how do we do this in a repeatable way so that at any point during the life cycle of the business, whether you're going to introduce a new product at some point, where you're going to expand to a new geography later down the road, like anytime you need to gather data to help you make more informed decisions about who your customer is today, who it should be tomorrow, what groups might allow you to grow and scale. What we've tried to create is a repeatable process that allows people to get and collect that information in a more simplistic format.
Yeah. Well, I go back to always like what we're doing informs product, it informs brand, it informs marketing. And as you're doing those things for brands to grow, brands have to have visibility. Like people need to know they exist. I think the second part is really important. There has to be a level of attraction in that visibility. Like I see you, I'm attracted to what you're doing. You're my kind of brand or my
Hmm.
kind of person. And then there has to be the credibility to back it up that says like, hey, and you can trust ultimately that we are what we say we are. If you have those 3 things, growth comes really rapidly. And obviously it's more complex than a couple of bullet points as part of the process. But I think like the real goal of segmentation work, of buyer psychology work, is understanding how do we attract who's attracted to what we have, first off, and how do we make ourselves even more attractive, right? It's recognizing that your protein bar is an on the go bar and it's not something that people are usually doing when they're at home. I've got an occasion. I'm out and I'm doing this and it's in my bag. Like it's recognizing that those are the kind of elements that you have. And you might not even be the number one bar that they buy, but you're an awesome bar for mid afternoon as I'm driving through like parent pickup to get
Hmm.
my kid to elementary school. Like knowing your occasion, knowing the motivations behind it unlocks this attractiveness. I think that makes it so that you can win rather than trying to be like, hey, we're now competing with every bar on the market. Instead, it's like these are our actual competitors and these are the customers we're trying to do. So we could go like way deep into segmentation and talk about like the how and all the details. But as you think about segmentation as a process, like what are 1 or 2 things that you could share where you're thinking, hey, these are the things that if you knew those, you could understand like how to make this happen, or these are the most important elements even of segmentation work. What are those
Yeah.
pillars for?
Yeah, I think I've alluded to it a little bit earlier, but I think far too many practitioners, and not just marketing folks, but anyone who's interested in solving this type of problem, like tends too often to start with demographics. And I think a lot of that is because that is the way that, their marketing arm currently works, or again, that's information that's been passed to them. Like our customer is this person, they look like this, they have these
Millennial
attributes.
mom.
Right. They have these attributes. And then so for that reason, your customer segmentation or equivalent process always starts from, well, what can we go out and learn about this person, that has these attributes that we've been told about? And that never really made sense to me. I kind of flip that. I've always flipped that on its head to allow the demographic piece of it to be the very last thing that we're looking at. Again, like what I'm more interested in is behaviors. Who is currently doing something? Who is currently buying, who previously purchased, who says that they're likely to purchase again in the future. And once you can establish like who those groups of people are, and if you go out and survey 1,000 people, you're cutting and slicing people into mutually exclusive segments, and you've got, 6 segments, and, that's your pie chart right there, right? And based on those behaviors and groups of behaviors, you're then saying, allow your curiosity to take over. If segment one is 30% of the population here, and those are the folks who are buying today, say they're most likely to continue purchasing in the future, have told you that they expect their spend on this product or this category to go up over the next 12 months, then I think the natural question you should start asking yourself is, well, why? So why do they expect their spend to go up? Why do they expect to spend more, to purchase more? So what are their motivations, right? That's where the kind of the motivational piece comes in once you have those behavioral segments established. So what's driving their purchases? What do they care about? Even backing all the way up to, before we learn a little bit more about why they're shopping this category or why they're looking for a particular product, like what do they think about the role of food in their life? How do they view food? Is it a, everyday, like, is it something that they attach to like their self identity? Those types of things are really important to contextualize their behaviors. And then that last piece is demographics. It's once we know, we have these groups of people that are behaving a certain way and they have these things that they care about, then it becomes rather simple to say, well, what can we tell about this group of people? Are they predominantly, you know, mothers in their, mid 30s to early 40s who have 2 to 3 kids living in a household of 3 to 5, and they've got a household income of XYZ. Like that's the point at which demographics become really useful, because now you're not just looking at, demographic attributes that exist on a page in isolation, but you've got almost a complete picture, or as complete a picture as you can get from what a large scale quantitative survey paired with some qualitative follow-up research can tell you about a group of people. So I think that's my biggest tip for anyone who's interested in this type of work, whether it's professional or, like just a personal interest. I think sometimes we get too obsessed with demographics, and maybe that's a result of, like an ad targeting world that is very hyper focused on those types of things. But
Good.
I think in order to get to that point, it's worthwhile backing up and looking at behaviors first, motivation second, that lead you to kind of demographic tendencies, as opposed to starting with, we've got this person and now
Yeah.
we need to go figure out how we message and reach this person.
Yeah. I mean, I think the reason why we typically start with demographics, right, is like that's where our analytics are. So for the most part, people are like, here's who's hitting our website up, or
Mm-hmm.
it's the most accessible information. And so we start there. And I think it's the easiest to like build a slide on, right? So like
Yeah.
putting your marketing strategy together as you're doing all that work, in the process of that, it's easy to get caught up, I think, on this idea of like, let me build a persona for you. And here's what the
Mm-hmm.
person looks like and all this kind of stuff. So it feels very tangible, even though millennial moms is like an example. It's my favorite example to use because it gets thrown around. Or Gen Z is the other one. Like
Yeah.
we have a Gen Z customer and it's like, cool. Gen Z is wildly diverse, and what they care about and how they act are incredibly different and diverse and complex. And so you can't start there because that makes no sense. It's the same thing as saying everyone in the Gen Z demographic or generation is our customer. That makes no sense at all. So, but I think we get caught up in that. And I think it's a great point of like, hey, reverse the order and suddenly you find yourself in a totally different position.
I think maybe I don't know if this is a tip as much as it's just like a blanket observation.
Yeah.
But I think another reason why, a lot of folks don't go down this path to do this type of work is because I think they assume that once they have the information, then that means that they need to like mechanize the organization or a win within the organization to go immediately like run and chase after how do we acquire these new sets of customers. And that can feel
Stop everything else.
like, yeah, that can feel really overwhelming to people. And it's quite frankly not something that, I would recommend doing or acting in such a manner. But I think one of the things about this type of work is it's in the same way that, forecasting and planning for the next year is critical to a business. I think this work falls in that bucket, right? Because I believe you want to be ready and to have a little bit of a plan before you decide that, hey, we need to grow for whatever reason, or we're going to expand into a new product line or a new category or a new geography. Um, this type of work, this type of information is really useful to give you a much bigger picture as to what is out there and what those pathways might look like. So even if you're doing like kind of basic scenario planning about what the future could hold, this is a really good way to get a qualified perspective on what that looks like beyond just who your core customer is today and why they're currently buying. I think the fact of the matter is, like, unless you have a really niche product and a really niche category, there's always going to be typically a handful of customer segments that could be core to your business, whether today or tomorrow. And my hypothesis, based on talking to a number of folks, is that the vast majority of people, once you start pressing beyond who is your core customer today, that's where you start to see and hear a lot more assumptive type thinking and reasoning. And if something happened tomorrow in the business where you had to go find another customer segment to market to or to sell your products to, I don't think most people are actually adequately equipped to do that. And so I think this is a really good exercise in forethought and planning for any kind of food and beverage company who knows and is thinking about what growth looks like.
Yeah. Well, it creates depth, I think, to your
Yeah.
point. And I think the other thing I see all the time is like, if you're building a marketing strategy, you need to have a multi-year perspective. It doesn't mean
Correct.
every tactic and quarter and
Yeah.
campaign is planned, but you have to know where you're going next year, not just this year. And when you can start to see, okay, we think we have X percentage of adoption within our, sub segments that are core to us. We think we can expand X, this much more into these other
Hmm.
categories and segments. You can quickly see, like, if we don't add any new products or SKUs, this is what our growth looks like. And here's how we could potentially then reach the next segments who care about these different things. So they might need a new SKU. Now I've got
Hmm.
a path towards product development, or it might even be, hey, these other segments are going to need this kind of messaging, or they're on these different channels. So you suddenly have a path as a brand or as a business where it's like, look, we know that for us to get this kind of growth in these new segments, we've got to do X, Y, and Z. And now I can pick the segments really I want to prioritize based on the investments that I have to make to reach them. And you go from a lot of guesswork because most teams, whether you're an emerging brand or you're a massive enterprise, you might have lots of resources in that enterprise, but you're still operating typically with really small teams where everyone's doing lots of stuff.
Hmm.
Without that kind of information, there's just a lot of guesswork. Yeah, becomes powerful. Last question for you as we wrap this up. Um, if you're gonna put on like the cap of, hey, I'm sitting in your chair, my question to you is, where would you start? Because there's 100 things you could do, right? And some of it feels really big, but what would be the first thing you would do if you sat down in their role?
I think there's two things I would do. One is where we typically start, which is, a fairly practical approach to gathering this information. And I think in 2025, like the word survey doesn't get a ton of people excited. I think a lot of people actually think it's like a data collection mechanism of the yesteryear. But again, if you're not taking the approach of, I'm trying to get absolute concrete answers that I can, you know, hold myself accountable to from now until the end of time, it is such a great tool to be able to quickly gather feedback from a representative sample of, in this case, let's call it the US population, to be able to start thinking about and be able to start identifying different groups of people that could become your customers. So the first thing I always tell people is like, don't discount surveys. They're a great tool, especially for most teams, whether you're, kind of startup mode, corporate, what have you. It's very, very accessible to most people, right? Like all you need is Microsoft Word or Google Docs to start creating, a set of survey questions that can give you the type of information that would allow you to have more concrete information than you currently have, and paired with a basic word processor and, some sort of survey platform with the way panels are easily constructed and purchased today, like those two combinations allow you to get much further than a lot of like the information that you probably have at your fingertips today. I think the other thing too is a lot of teams, organizations, what have you, are sitting on like outdated information. And so, when you think about having to hit refresh on that data, especially if it's coming from, consumers, that feels like it's going to be some like rigorous, time intensive and lengthy and expensive exercise. And I would just counsel and coach people to kind of break things down into the smallest possible chunks and know that, like the ability to put together a survey, get it launched and get that data back. You can do that in a matter of hours if you have the right tools, or days, depending on how quickly you want to go about that process. So I would just say don't discount surveys in 2025 and beyond, because it is still to this day, I think, the most practical way to get that type of information at scale from people that could potentially be a core buyer.
Yeah, I love that. Well, and to that point, I think oftentimes when you sit down in that chair for the first time, and you're like thinking, okay, what's next? I think the question you should be asking is, how confident in am I in what I know today?
Hmm.
Mm, Every time you go out and gather information from a survey, pick a tool and a model, you're really just saying, how do I go from where I am today, which I honestly think most people are under 50%, like
Hmm.
confident that they understand who their customer is and what that looks like. Well, if you're pushing into 80, 90% confidence, it's wildly different where you place your bets. So, well, thanks for jumping on, for having this conversation, talking about why people buy, and joining the podcast today, John, and appreciate it so much.
Yeah, this was fun. Always happy to dive into this topic.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you very much. Bye bye.